of musical ideas or sketches, a jigsaw no one should complete.
Listening to Today on Radio 4 with James Naughtie and Sue McGregor.
25 minutes past 8. Now, Elgar's unfinished Third Symphony is going to be finished after all. The composer's descendants had originally refused requests for it to be completed. His dying wish, apparently, was that it shouldn't be. The copyright's running out in the year 2004, and the family's now going to act. The BBC will broadcast the finished symphony at the Proms next year. The controller of Radio 3 and the director of the Proms, Nicholas Kenyon's on the line now. What would Elgar have made of that? The composer Anthony Payne had known these sketches for many years, and he was convinced that they should be heard.
It was the absolute quality of the sketches which made me fall in love with them. I immediately thought, this is absolutely grade A Elgar, and I felt inspired by fingering them through at the piano, and I couldn't understand why so many people had dismissed them. They seemed to me to show Elgar in full inspirational flight.
The idea of writing the Third Symphony took off after a long fallow period in Elgar's musical life. He'd been hit hard by the death of his wife, Caroline Alice, in 1920. He came back here to his beloved Worcestershire. Since the death of my dear wife, I've done nothing, and fear my music has vanished, he wrote. He also felt strangely out of fashion, and lived the life of a country gentleman, walking his dogs, enjoying this countryside. I feel like these woods, all aglow, a spark would start a flame, but no human spark comes. When the spark did come, it sprang from one of the strong friendships of those years, with George Bernard Shaw.
He was constantly being bullied by George Bernard Shaw to write another symphony. I think Shaw probably believed that if he wrote another symphony, it would be therapeutic for him, and he would continually chide him about this symphonic thing. And then, of course, Shaw badgered the BBC, saying, why don't you commission a symphony from Elgar? You can afford to, he said. And I think during this time, this whole business of Shaw continually talking about the Third Symphony made Elgar begin to think.
One person who knew Elgar particularly well at this time was his godson, Woolston Atkins, who remembers when he turned his mind to the Third Symphony.
Well, at that time, Elgar had on his piano one work only, and that was The Spanish Lady. Then I noticed that apart from this pile, which was getting fairly large then of The Spanish Lady, a second pile had started up, marked SYM3, and I realized that he had at last got round to putting something on paper for the Third Symphony, which he'd been talking about for at least 20 years before. There was a sudden change. There was tremendous power coming from Elgar. There was positive force there that you actually felt. And my father said, Elgar is now in exactly the same state of creativity as he was in when he wrote all his major works, like The Dream of Gerontius and the First and Second Symphony.
Most of the sketches were not fully orchestrated by the time of Elgar's death. He used to play them at the piano, and he even wrote out a special violin part for his friend Billy Reed, the pianist David Owen Norris.
When he got his initial seed of inspiration, he would sit at the piano, usually with somebody else there, and he'd show off a bit. He required the stimulus of somebody else there to help him develop this music. He had Billy Reed come down and he would show Billy what he was thinking of doing with the symphony. The sketches really seem to come alive when I play them with Robert Gibbs, whose violin is the very same one that Billy Reed used to play with Elgar.
I inherited this violin from my aunt, who was a pupil of Reed's in the 30s. This was the violin that he used for all his workshop sessions with Elgar. I feel this is a direct link between now and the original writing of Elgar.
One always knew when he was going to be there, you would find sketches pinned to everything, the curtains and laying on the table and the chairs and everything else. They were absolutely smothered in these. So I said to Billy, now, what's all this mystery about the Third Symphony? I suppose you know something about it. And he said, no, I don't know anything about it at all. And if I attempt to say anything about it, he usually says, oh, that's enough of that. Let's take the dogs for a walk.
To sense the spirit behind the Third Symphony sketches, you have to look at the countryside. It was in the tranquility and pastoral peace of the English landscape that Elgar's creative spirit flourished. He loved these hills, and it was said that he knew every lane in Worcestershire, cycling through them when he was young, still walking them when he was older. There's music in the air, he said. Anthony Payne had for many years been nursing the idea of bringing Elgar's sketches to life for the orchestra.
I saw them, I suppose, with an orchestral eye, you might say. Although I was looking at what on the page looks like a piano score, I heard them in my inner ear as orchestral music, and also I could see how they could be joined up. Because with Elgar, you see all these little snippets, and that's the way he worked, and he would join them together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. He'd try one piece with another piece, then try them the other way round and put them together in different orders. He constructed his pieces like that. He had that sort of grasshopper mind where he put pieces together in different orders and toyed with them like some kind of puzzle. I think that really is the key to the way his mind worked. It was an incredible experience to see the actual sketches for the first time. There were these little pages with odd things on, like cartoon characters. They don't, I will say, reveal anything about the music. To see little birds and men and cats and dogs all sitting in serried ranks on one page, and he's written underneath, waiting for the Third Symphony. This is just a sort of Elgar joke, really. But they do make you feel very, very close to him, to see part of his everyday life actually appearing on the page, along with this searing music.
Here at Elgar's birthplace, just outside Worcester, there's a unique collection celebrating his life, set in the heart of his countryside. Elgar asked that he be remembered here, so even his desk is set up in the way that his daughter Carice remembered it. And it's appropriate that it was here that his great-nephew Paul Grafton and his great-niece Hilary Elgar came to discuss the decision they faced. Should they allow the Third Symphony to be completed?
When the family were first approached in this connection in 1995, I found it easy to decide that this was something, the elaboration of the sketches was something that we didn't really want to happen. There is, of course, the issue that the sketches lose copyright protection in 2004 and would then be open to widespread exploitation. That's an important factor, but not to my mind a decisive factor. Far more important in my mind was the question as to what Elgar's dying wishes actually were. When his daughter Carice and his best friend Billy Reed were sitting by his bedside, he was in some anguish that others might complete the work, and his daughter and his best friend assured him that this would not be allowed to happen. So I was in some puzzlement that, in fact, his daughter and his best friend Billy Reed, who had given him the assurances that this wouldn't be allowed to happen, were the very people who perhaps did most to ensure that it would happen by allowing the sketches to be published in The Listener a year after he died, and a year after that publishing them again in Billy Reed's book.
It was a difficult decision because there were Edward's words, "I want no one to tinker with my symphony." The word tinker, I think, is important because back in 1934, there was no one on the scene who perhaps understood Elgar. But that was 60 years ago, and that was before Anthony Payne came on the scene. And because of his tremendous devotion to Elgar and his complete understanding of the music, we felt he was our one salvation, that he could give to the public what they'd been waiting years to hear.
But not everyone agreed with their decision. The story filtered out, and the family was heavily criticised. The music critics, like Stephen Johnson, were divided.
I would be telling a very big fib indeed if I said I'd never had any doubts about the ethics of this thing. I have wondered once or twice, what would Elgar have thought? Would he have recognised the fact that Tony has gone a very different way in certain cases from what he would have done, and felt disgusted by it, angry at it? I don't know, I can't say. Inevitably, there was some prickly reactions at first. To some degree, this was orchestrated. I think there was a degree of searching around in the newspapers and the radio and the television to kind of stir it up a bit and look for the people who had the crustiest reactions against this. But what happened, I think, was it began to, I think, filter through in some way that Tony Payne is a very remarkable and conscientious person, and that he had undertaken this with a degree of humility.
It was rather different, I must say, actually completing the symphony from the sort of experience I've had in my life writing my own music. For one thing, and I'm awfully sorry this makes me appear immodest, but it was easier. I'm always being asked about the great moral responsibility and the feeling of the great man peering over my shoulder, perhaps. But to be honest, I felt sometimes that I was almost being fed ideas. Things fell into place in my mind in an astonishing kind of way, and when I got to a difficult corner, I would often wake up in the middle of the night and think, that's the way that section should go, and this never happens with my own music. When I talk about Elgar's Third Symphony, I've been known to call it a great work, and I suddenly realised that this sounds absolutely awful. It's because I don't think of it as being by me, really. It's not in my language. It's in Elgar's language, which I've imitated, and I really see it as Elgar's Third Symphony, which I've had a part in completing. It's quite difficult to quantify my contribution to the symphony. I suppose in the end, I have to say I composed probably about half of it. And as for the orchestration, which is an incredibly important element in Elgar, it carries so much expressive weight, the way Elgar uses the orchestra. I did nearly all of it. I had to ape his orchestral style for the rest of the time. I loved writing in Elgar's orchestral style. That was really fun. I felt I was actually being Elgar. The climax of the whole process, all the agonies of the politics of it, and now you can do it, now you can't, and all my compositional problems, the whole process reached its climax, I suppose, with the first performance. And they said it was extraordinary. They felt almost as if they were back in the 1930s, because they were giving, as they felt it, an Elgar premiere. But it was 1997, an extraordinary time warp.
The conductor at that first performance was Andrew Davis.
I think Tony Payne's elaboration of the sketches for Elgar's Third Symphony to give the piece its correct title has turned out to be one of the most important works that we've seen in the past decade, probably. I mean, it's a remarkable achievement. When I first got the score of the piece, when only sort of 5/8 of it was done, I decided I wasn't going to discover at that point what was Elgar and what wasn't. I didn't really want to know. I know now. But I wanted to take it as a piece that I would prepare in the same way that I would prepare anything else, on the face value of what the music was as it stood, without sort of going into all the detective work.
After the first performance, the recording became a bestseller, and the symphony was greeted with almost unanimous praise, which is not always the case with completions. Stephen Johnson.
Lots of people have attempted this kind of thing with rather dubious results. For every Derek Cook's Mahler 10, there are lots and lots of completions which are not so convincing, in fact, a good deal less convincing. Now, Elgar didn't leave a complete sketch. There are great big gaps in this, and that was because Elgar's way of working was very different from Mahler's. But he did leave clues, which Tony Payne has marvellously, I think, been able to infer what Elgar might have done at this point. There is something about Elgar 3 which is absolutely typical of the great late Romantic symphony. It has a kind of narrative. You feel that it's telling a story. You may not be able to say quite what that story is, but nevertheless it's a story that's alive and compels you. It's full of colour, drama, excitement. It's warm. At the same time, it has this amazing lyrical dimension. I mean, Elgar thought melodically. Elgar thought in terms of tunes. That's how he argued. That's how he made his structures. So on the one hand, you've got this melodic thinking, which is very, very immediate and very friendly and draws you in and makes you want to sing it almost as you're listening to it. At the same time, that's actually part of quite a profound intellectual process.
I think I only began to have a thought about the meaning, the overall meaning of this symphony, when I was getting close to the end. I have to say that a lot of the time I was sort of deeply inside it and really worrying about individual problems and letting the broad plan take care of itself. I felt that things were going right, but towards the end it began to occur to me what this symphony really was about. It's got everything of Elgar in it, and I really do see it as a summary of everything he could do. He might even have consciously felt that it was, to some extent, a summary of his whole life's work.
When I listen to that work, and I listen to the slow movement particularly, and I think, how would Elgar feel at the thought of this great music never being heard? I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's such marvellous music. I mean, being available only in sketch form to academics or musicians who patently got it wrong about the worth of this music for year after year after year. Surely it has to be better in the end that people are able to hear this music and respond to it in the way they so obviously have. I mean, great music is not written to be silent.
I remember thinking, will these ever be performed? And I really had made up my mind, whether I received permission or not, that when I had time I would complete the work and just keep it in my bottom drawer for posterity. I told myself, if I'd have been told then in about 1994, when things were at a low ebb, that one day they'd be performed, I would have been utterly speechless with the joy of it, I think, you know.